Well, hello, my friends. It's Rose, and I'm back with another drill and read. Today, I'm going to be reading Chapter 6 of the Magnate's Manifesto by Jennifer Hayward. This is a Harlequin Presents novel that I started reading a few weeks ago, and if you haven't seen or listened to the previous chapters, look up in the little eye in the top right-hand corner of your screen, and you'll find a playlist that you can click on, and you can listen to chapters 1 to 5.
If you're watching this
later on, that playlist will include every chapter of this book. So as I add a new chapter, it'll be there. What I'll do at the very end of this video is include a card to that playlist so that after you've listened to chapter 6, you can go and listen to chapter 7 if it's been posted already. All right. So settle in, get your diamond painting ready, or whatever it is that you're doing, and let's find out what happens next with Bailey and Jared. Chapter 6. By day 3 in Nice, Jared was feeling good about the progress they had made on the presentation. They were holed up in a villa in the hills overlooking the sea, owned by one of his friends, where the outside world was a distant distraction and pretty much everything else could wait. Bailey had been in charge of scaling the creative ideas and adding in the market research data that Alexander had requested, which had, thankfully, proved them extremely viable. Jared concentrated on countering the intent to purchase consumer data that Alexander had magically come up with, while also carrying out a full analysis of their competition, Gehrig Electronics, to uncover weak spots they could exploit. Unfortunately, Gehrig was a strong prospect with a rich technological heritage, a company going through a hot streak, and consumers loved buzz. He tossed his pen down on Hans's desk. They would beat Gehrig, because although the other manufacturer had good products coming, he had better ones, inspired ones that would set the world on fire. And although he'd had a whole strategic plan in place to unveil those products to the world, maybe it was time to let the cat out of the bag. He got up and walked over to the window that overlooked the terrace. Bailey was sitting in a lounge chair in the sunshine, bent over her computer, hard at work as she had been for the past 3 15-hour days. Invaluable to him. And, he thought, his ticking time bomb, all in one beautiful package. She wasn't talking. She refused to address Alexander when he brought him up. It was a problem. His mobile peeled from the corner of the desk. He walked over and retrieved it. Sam Walters. Great. Sam! He cradled the phone to his ear as he sat down and swung his feet up onto the desk. You didn't call. What's going on with Maison? I'm getting all sorts of questions I can't answer. Join the crowd, Jared thought. His jaws came together with a resounding crunch. David's passed the decision to his son, Alexander, who will become CEO next year. Alexander has decided he needs to do due diligence and give Gehrig Electronics a shot at the partnership. We're revamping the presentation to pitch against them next week. Gehrig? I thought this was a one-horse race. Not anymore. Apparently, my manifesto has dropped our brand rating with female consumers. There was a long pause. Jared sighed. Don't say it, Sam. You know I have to. The next time you get inspired to philosophize, Jared, don't. His lips twisted. I would heartily agree with you, but that horse is out of the gate. Now we have to win. Yes, you do. You know I'm doing everything I can to shore things up for you until you get those products to market, but this will make a statement. The muscles in his head clenched like a vice, a deep throb radiating through his skull. I'm ultra clear on this, Sam. Mea culpa, my mess. We will win. Meanwhile, let me know if you've got anything on Gehrig. I have a week to pull them apart. I'll make some calls. Thanks. Appreciate it. Jared? You created Stone Industries. You're the only man who should be leading it. That's all the focus you need. A smile curved his lips. Thanks for having my back, Sam. He put the phone down, wondered what he would have done if he hadn't bumped into Sam at a startup conference in the Valley and begun a lifelong friendship with the mentor who'd taken him under his wing when his father had gone AWOL, who'd taught him that sometimes you could trust a person, that sometimes they were always there for you. And for a young, hot-headed Jared with an astronomically successful startup on his hands, it had meant the difference between being a dot-com failure and the solid, profitable company Stone Industries was today. An email brought his attention back to his computer screen. It was from his PI, Danny. Bingo! Can I say this one was my pleasure? Why that made his inside twists, he didn't know. He opened the report, printed it, and threw it in a folder. He also didn't know why he did that. Maybe he wanted to give Bailey a chance to tell him herself first. Maybe, as he'd said from the beginning, trust was paramount to him. And maybe he knew what it was like to avoid the past because it only brought pain with it. And you couldn't change it no matter how much you wanted to. Maybe he liked Bailey St. John far more than he was willing to admit. Bailey was bleary-eyed by the time she dragged herself away from her computer to join Jared for dinner on the intimate little seaside terrace of the villa that overlooked the Mediterranean Sea. Smaller and cozier than David Gagnon's showpiece of a home, it was luxurious but understated, the kind of place you could hide away forever in. If only she could. She pushed her hair away from her face and took a long sip of the full-bodied red Jared had unearthed from the cellar. You didn't actually relax when your boss looked as if he wanted to toss you off the cliff you were sitting on into the glorious azure waters below. When decisions you'd made in the past suddenly seemed questionable, when at the time they'd seemed like the only way out. Jared topped up her glass and stood up. We're taking a break from work tonight. Both our brains are fried. True. She stifled a surge of relief as she surveyed him in jeans and a navy t-shirt. Then thought maybe it was a bad idea because work had meant there was no space in her brain to remember that kiss. I think I might try to get some sleep, she demurred. I haven't been doing so much of that. He stared her down. I built a fire in the pit. Sky's perfect for star spotting. And here I did not figure you for a Boy Scout. The wood was there, he said dryly. I piled it up. Come. He picked up his glass and a blue folder he'd left on the chair and started walking down the hill. Hadn't he said no business? Maybe there was a detail he wanted to chew over, and that was good, because then they wouldn't be diverging into the personal, and Jared wouldn't be prying for information on Alexander Gagnon. She stood up and followed him down to the fire pit with her wine. A series of big boulders with flat surfaces had been positioned around the pit to sit on. She lowered herself onto one and watched as Jared lit the paper and coaxed the fire into a steady flame. My father loved fires, he said. Used to see how big he could make them go. How old were you when your father embezzled the money? He glanced at her, his profile hard and unyielding in the firelight. More questions while you remain a mystery? She lifted a shoulder. You brought him up. I was in my second year of university. That's why you dropped out? Yes. He walked around and agitated the logs with a stick. My parents had been helping me. I couldn't afford it after we lost everything. What happened to your father when it was discovered he took the money? He put the stick down and came to sit beside her on a neighboring rock. He went to jail for 3 years. Oh. She'd wondered if the more lenient laws on white-collar crime had kept him out of jail. What does he do now? He stretched his long legs out in front of him and looked into the fire. While he was in jail, my mother divorced him and married the head of the European Central Bank. When my father got out, he disappeared. I had him traced to the Caribbean, where he's been living in a hut on the beach ever since. Wow, she tried to digest it all. Do you have any idea why he did it? His lip curled, emphasizing the rather dangerous-looking, twisting white scar that ran across it. Why he stole money from his employer and his closest friends? I'd have to be a psychologist to diagnose, but it might have something to do with my mother. She bled him dry every day of his life, and it was still never enough. She pulled in a breath. Well, there you go. When you had attitudes like his, they came from somewhere. What do you mean, bled him dry? He looked back at the fire. She didn't know when to stop. My father made a fortune in investment banking. But you could tell in the later years he was done. He needed a break. But she never let him back off. Their wealth defined her. When she couldn't flash the latest $100,000 Maserati in front of her friends, when my father failed to provide, she left. His jaw hardened as he turned to her. And if you're going to ask what happened then, my father lost the plot completely, as in his mind. She looked over at him in the silence that followed, as big as any she'd encountered. Still? Is he still like that? He kept his gaze trained on the leaping flames. I haven't talked to him in a long time. I don't know. I send him money every month, and he takes it. She stared at him. How hard that must have been. How much it must have hurt. His manifesto made so much sense to her all of a sudden. Not all women are like your mother, Jared. I'm not. See, here's where I'm having a problem with that, Bailey. His low, tight tone sent a frisson of warning dancing across her skin. I don't even know who you are. I have a multi-million-dollar deal tangled up in a woman with a past that could bring it crashing down around us, and you won't talk. She flinched. I've told you all that's relevant. Now you're going to tell me the real story. He picked up the folder sitting beside him and waved it at her. This is where it ends. She stared at the folder, her heart speeding up. What is that? It's your past, Bailey, in one convenient little package. He was holding it with his far hand, far enough out of her reach that she never could have gotten to it. But she realized that wasn't the exercise. Who did it? She demanded quietly. My private investigator. And trust me when I say he didn't miss anything. Her blood pounded in her veins. Suddenly, she felt very, very lightheaded. Jared, I can't. You can. I've just told you the whole sordid story of my family. Now it's your turn. I haven't read it, Bailey. This is your chance. She watched with big eyes as he stood up, walked to the fire, and threw the folder into the flames. It sparked and licked up the paper until it turned gray and curled in on itself, just like her stomach. He turned back to her and stuck his hands in his pockets. Who is Alexander Gagnon to you, Bailey? What does he have on you? The flames licking the folder engulfed the remainder in a fiery glow. His gesture wasn't lost on her. He was giving her a chance to tell her side of the story, to trust him as he'd trusted her from the beginning. A clamminess invaded her palms, a byproduct of her racing heart and the adrenaline surging through her. A million thoughts filled her head, but in the end, it came down to the truth. I met Alexander Gagnon when he came to my show at the Red Room in Las Vegas. The Red Room? Isn't that a strip joint? That's right. She met his gaze. I was a high-class stripper, Jared. I made oodles of money taking off my clothes for men. His Adam's apple bobbed as if he was going to say something. His lips pursed as words formed. Then he stopped, stared at her, and waved a hand. Go on. She let her lashes drift down over her eyes. When I was 17, I snuck into Tampa with a girlfriend of mine. We were hanging out in the big city, loitering on the streets with pretty much nothing in our pockets, when a girl came up to me, a dancer from the hottest nightclub in the city. She told me I should apply for a job there, that I could make good money. She twisted her hands in her lap and stared down at them. You have to understand, we were dirt poor, my family. My father was an alcoholic, was off the job more than he was on. My mother was doing all she could to make ends meet, but her hair salon wasn't bringing in much. So when she told me how much money I could make dancing, I was flabbergasted. I had dance training. It was one of the few things I was able to do because the local teacher let me study without paying because she thought I had potential. He blinked. So you started stripping? She nodded. I made more money in a week dancing than my mother made in a month cutting hair. I took it home, paid for things. But when my father found out what I was doing, he hit the roof. Her mouth turned down. They weren't making ends meet. My sister had no clothes, but my money was dirty money, so he kicked me out. A frown creased his forehead. How old were you? 17. And believe me, she said bitterly, nothing was ever so good. My father was not a nice drunk. His eyes darkened. God, Bailey, you were a baby. How were you even allowed to be in a bar? I lied. Got a fake ID. He sat down beside her, rested his elbows on his knees, and pressed his hands to his temples. So you moved from Tampa to Vegas, where you go to school, and you kept stripping? I moved there to dance, to pay my way through school. The money is fantastic in Vegas, if you know what you're doing. I danced at a couple of different clubs, learned the industry, then I landed a slot at the Red Room. Every girl wanted to work there. It was very burlesque in the way we did the shows. They had the most beautiful women, and it was where all the high rollers hung out. I made a ton of money, easily paid for school every year. He scrunched his face up. Didn't it bother you the way men looked at you? Like I belonged in the bedroom? She threw his words back at him with a lift of her chin. It was a job, Jared, like any other occupation. I went to work, made a lot of money, and got out when I could. You took your clothes off in front of strangers. That is not a normal job. Heat rose up inside of her, headed for the surface. My body was all I had. That was it. My sister, Annabelle, is still in Lakeland, working a $10 an hour job and dealing with an alcoholic husband of her own. She stared at him, her frustration bubbling over. I had dreams, Jared, just like you had. Except you had a brain and I had my body, so I used it. His gaze darkened. You also have an incredibly sharp brain. Why didn't you use it? I didn't know that. Frustration grabbed at her, tore at her composure. As far as I was concerned, I was low-income trash from the swamp, and no one ever tried to convince me differently. Not my teachers, classmates, not the girls who wouldn't let me into their cliques. I was the poor Williams girl who was never going to amount to anything. Well, damn it, I did. He rubbed his hands over his eyes. St. John is not your real name? She shook her head. I changed it when I left Vegas for California. Is Bailey your real name? Yes. My mother named me after her favorite drink. His eyes widened at that. He was silent for a long time, head in his hands. When he finally looked up, his expression was bleak. When you say high-end stripper, what does that mean? She thought, did she do favors for her clients on the side, is what he really meant. Something inside her retracted, curled up before it could be killed off, before she showed him exactly how much that hurt. You want to know if I slept with the men I danced for. Yes, he answered harshly. Would it make any difference if I said yes? Would it make the stigma of what she'd been worse? God damn it, Bailey, answer the question. I danced, she said stonily, and then I went home and studied. Nothing more. Ever. He let out a long breath. Where does Alexander Gagnon fit in all of this? She laced her hands together and stared into the hissing, sparkling fire. Every week at the Red Room, the owner would have his favorite dancer do a special number at the end of the night. You were the star attraction, wore fancy red lingerie, got tons of tips for it. That week, he chose me. She registered the speculative look on Jared's face and chose to ignore it. Alexander came to the Red Room for the first time on a Tuesday night. He gave me a huge tip and asked me to have a drink with him. For some reason, I refused. He was well dressed, had this aura about him that you couldn't ignore. But there was something I didn't trust. And in that business, it was all about instinct. He didn't want any of the other girls. He came back 2 other nights after that, always tipping heavily, and asked me to have a drink with him. On the 3rd night, I said no, went to my dressing room, and started taking off my makeup. I was the last girl to leave. The others were all in a rush to go out that night, and I was just going home to study, so I took my time. At one point, I had this feeling I wasn't alone, and I turned around, and there he was, Alexander, she qualified, just standing there. His gaze narrowed. How did he get past the bouncers? She grimaced. I found out later he'd bribed Bruno, my manager, to make them look the other way. I don't know what Alexander had on Bruno to make him do that. Bruno was a big gambler. He owed people a lot of money, so maybe that was it. Anyway, she said, waving a hand, I was shocked, totally thrown. I told him to get out, and he completely ignored me. Then what? Jared growled. He propositioned me. What do you mean, propositioned you? He offered me $50,000 to sleep with him. A dangerous glimmer entered his eyes. For one night? Yes. What happened when you turned him down? Her fingers tightened around her glass. He told me everyone has a price, to name mine. I told him to get the hell out again, and this time he did. And that was it? He came back 2 more nights to see if I'd changed my mind. I never saw him after that. Jesus, Bailey! He stood up and paced to the fire, raked his hands through his hair. Why didn't you tell me? Tell you? She gave him a disbelieving look. You, the man who just wrote a manifesto about how women belong in the bedroom, not the boardroom? You have to be joking. Oh, for God's sake, you know that doesn't apply to you. He gave his head a shake. What did he say to you on the yacht? You looked shaken. He realized that nobody knows, that I've hidden my past. And? She shook her head. You interrupted us then. His gaze sharpened on her face. You can't run away from the past forever. It always catches up with you. Her mouth twisted. So I should just tell everyone I was a stripper? Get it out of the way? I have worked my entire life to put my past behind me, Jared. I'm not ashamed of what I did, but others will judge me. Jared Stone's chief marketing officer, former stripper. How do you think that'll go over? He was silent, because she was right. He still wants you, he muttered after a long moment. He wants to win. That much is clear. Bailey felt her past close like a noose around her neck. Finally, it had caught up with her. She'd always thought it might. But did it have to be now? Right at the moment she'd thought she just might rise above it? Tears of frustration singed the back of her eyes. She drained the rest of her wine and set the glass on the ground. I am now a liability, she said quietly. You need to take me out of this presentation, Jared. Eliminate me from the equation. You know it, and I know it. Blue eyes tangled with the darker blue. The flicker in his was almost indiscernible, but she didn't miss it. The acknowledgement that she was right. Pull me out, she repeated dully, getting to her feet. It's the right thing to do. and then she walked away before she bawled her eyes out. Jared watched Bailey go, so dumbstruck by what she just told him, he was actually incapable of pursuing. She'd been a high-end stripper in Vegas. She had taken her clothes off for total strangers every night, pocketed scads of money, and put herself through school with it. The idea of Bailey putting herself on display like that, letting men drool over her like that, was so far-fetched it was almost laughable. He would have laughed if he wasn't so appalled. Here he'd been picturing her selling shoes at the local mall to put herself through school, making cappuccinos at the local cafe. Instead, she'd been balling up the cash men shoved in her G-string to survive and sacrificing her innocence along with it. Dear God. And then there was the image of Bailey dancing in expensive lingerie on a stage that wouldn't leave his head. How many men had gotten off seeing her like that? And why did that idea torture him? He went for the whiskey then, because quite honestly, he didn't know what else to do. A 16-year-old Lagavulin he found in the lounge would do the trick. Might help wipe from his head the look on Bailey's face when he tossed that file into the fire and forced her hand. She'd never wanted anyone to know about that part of her life, and he'd made her reveal it. He carried the tumbler out onto the terrace and rested his palms on the railing. The sea glistened at the base of the cliffs in the moonlight. The whiskey slid down his throat, smoky and salty, a welcome heat to counter the disquiet plaguing him. He'd needed to know, had to know. The ends justified the means. But now what? He should take Bailey off the pitch. He should handle it alone for both their sakes. It was clear Alexander Gagnon had a fixation with her. He'd offered her an insane amount of money to sleep with him. And a man like that just didn't give up. He pursued until he won. To hell with his deal. But there was also David to consider. Bailey was his ace in the hole when it came to the elder Gagnon, and he was still very much in the picture. He needed her thinking to win. The whiskey slid down his throat, smooth and fiery. Bailey's words echoed in his head. I had dreams, Jared, just like you had, except you had a brain and I had my body, so I used it. The look on her face when she'd given up, when she told him to take her off the deal. His guts twisted. Bailey had fought her way out of a life most people would have accepted as their fate and never tried to rise above. But she had. She hadn't let it define her. She was the smartest, most composed, drop-dead beautiful woman he'd ever met. Her brilliant ideas had made their presentation. He stared out at the brightly lit boats bobbing on the sea, their smooth roll telegraphing a calm night to come. And a strange kind of certainty settled over him. Bailey needed someone to believe in her. He was pretty sure she'd never had that, and he was not giving up on her. It wasn't even a question. It was then that Jared Stone realized his manifesto was the biggest piece of crap he'd ever written. Bailey had just slipped her nightie on when a knock came at the door. Her emotions far too close to the surface, she stayed where she was. I'm fine, Jared. I'm fine with all of it. I just need some sleep. I'm not leaving until I talk to you. Open the door. His tone was hard, implacable, like Jared was. She cursed, grabbed her robe, and tugged it on. Attempted to compose herself as she pulled the door open and found him standing there like a fierce warrior, filling the doorway with his broad-shouldered frame. I am not dropping you, he announced. We are partners, and we are doing this together. Jared, she bit her lip, furiously blinking back tears. Even after what she just told him, he was still backing her? We are a team, he said quietly, blue gaze softening. I've told you that from the beginning. You trusted me enough to tell me about your past tonight, and I know that wasn't easy. I need you in that room with me, Bailey. You've proven that. A tear slid down her cheek. She couldn't help it. No one had ever shown such faith in her. She'd been going it alone since she was 17, and suddenly she felt so tired of it, tired of fighting every battle by herself. Christ, Bailey! He took a step forward and brushed the tear away with the pad of his thumb. Did you think I was just going to abandon you after everything you've put into this? Those are your ideas, David loves. She looked down, anywhere but at him, but the tears kept rolling. I thought you wouldn't respect me, that you wouldn't want me anywhere near this deal if you knew what I'd been. He slid his fingers under her chin and brought her gaze back up to his. I'm not going in there without you. And as for respecting you, I've never respected a woman more in my life, for who you are, for what you've done. Something melted inside of Bailey, something that had been frozen for so long she'd forgotten it existed. She thought it might be her heart. But what about Alexander? Lord knows what he's capable of, and I would never forgive myself if you lose this deal because of me. I'm not going to lose, he said softly. Alexander Gagnon likes to win. I like to win more. But he pressed his fingers against her lips. She fell silent in a sea of confusion that had only one focal point, the electricity that was so strong between them that it held her completely still as his eyes darkened with an emotion she couldn't read. He put his mouth to the hot, wet tears dampening her cheeks and kissed every one away with a slow drag of his lips that started out comforting and ended up something else entirely. Hot, scorching hot. She didn't know who kissed who first. It was unspoken communication, her hands cupping his jaw, devouring him, while his found the belt to her robe, untied it, and pushed it off her shoulders. She moved into him until her bare skin was molded against the hard muscles of his chest, tasting him, knowing him, until she wasn't sure where she started and he ended. You are so beautiful, he rasped, his mouth leaving hers to trail a path of fire down her throat. When he hit the ultra-sensitive spot between her neck and shoulder, she gasped and arched to give him better access. He took full advantage, nuzzling and exploring until she dug her hands into his shoulders and demanded more. He drew back and took her in. Color swept every centimeter of her skin. We can't do this. You're my boss. He shook his head. It's never been that simple with us, and you know it. Jared. He slid a finger under the spaghetti strap of her nightie and slipped it off her shoulder. Her heart pounded in her chest as he weighed her breast in his palm and learned the shape of her. She could have pulled away then, should have pulled away. But the want in her shocked her. The fact she'd never let a man touch her like this becoming inconsequential somewhere around the time he took her inside the heat of his mouth, and her knees went weak. She could have pulled away then, should have pulled away, but the want in her shocked her. The fact she'd never let a man touch her like this becoming inconsequential somewhere around the time he took her inside the heat of his mouth, and her knees went weak. The rush, the sweet, all-encompassing rush knocked her brain sideways. She buried her fingers in his hair and closed her eyes, and for once in her life just let herself feel want. He slid his jean-clad leg between her thighs and brought her closer. He was hard and rough against her sensitive skin, and it excited her beyond belief. She moved against him and whimpered, Jared. He slid the strap off her other shoulder and flicked his tongue over her engorged nipple, gave her what her husky entreaty hadn't been able to verbalize, and the unfamiliar throb inside her reached a fever pitch. Somehow she was in his arms, and he was striding across the room to the sofa in the lounge. He sat down, wrapped her legs around him, and brought his mouth back to hers in a red-hot kiss that pulled her under again. She should have been alarmed at how fast things were moving, that they were moving at all, given her lack of experience. But somehow, with Jared, it felt so right. She buried her mouth in the hollow of his neck, and explored his musky, salty, utterly male scent. He found the hem of her nightie and pushed it up. Her gaze tracked his movements as he trailed his fingers over the concave dip where her hip met thigh. "You are all woman," he murmured huskily. "Too much, I'd say." He shook his head. "You are perfection. You know what I was thinking that night that you asked me to choose the shoes?" "What?" He trailed his fingers along the edge of her panties, down to where she was on fire for him. "This." His whispered answer sent a shiver down her spine. Her stomach curled into a hard, tight ball as he brought his thumb to her center and rotated it so achingly slowly she thought she might go up in flames. "I thought that if we'd been on a date," he continued huskily, "I would have kept you there until I'd made you come, at least twice." She lost her composure then. "Jared." He put his fingers to her mouth. Better late than never, don't you think? Having never had an orgasm in her life, Bailey couldn't answer that question. And good thing she didn't have to, because Jared flipped their positions then, went down on his knees in front of the sofa, and lifted his gaze to hers. "Spread your legs for me, sweetheart." Her pulse went into overdrive, tattooing itself against her veins, so hard she thought she might pass out. She didn't know it was possible to feel so turned on and so excruciatingly self-conscious at the same time. But the blazing heat of his deep blue gaze spurred her on, lustful, full of want. Nothing she wasn't ready to give. Her thighs fell apart. He worked his palms up the inside of them, arranging her to his satisfaction until she couldn't look any more and close her eyes. And then his hands were under her hips, urging her forward. His mouth was hot against her center, burning a trail against her damp panties, and Bailey forgot her name. He tugged off her underwear with an impatient movement, setting his mouth to her heated flesh, where she was wet and wanting him. Hot, sweet pleasure coursed through her, curled her toes. "Beautiful, you are so beautiful," he murmured against her skin. "Twice might not be enough." She closed her eyes. The hot slide of his tongue against her made her whimper, and he did it again and again, varying the pressure and rhythm, asking her how she liked it. She gave him rational, honest responses at first, and then she started shaking and needing something more, and she begged him to shut up. His soft laughter flickered across the sensitive skin of her thighs. The smooth slide of his finger, as he eased it inside her, tore a moan from her throat. Then he brought his tongue back into play, and the world went a hazy gray. This, she realized instinctively, was what she needed. "Bailey," he murmured. "Baby, give it up." She arched her hips and clutched the fabric of the sofa as he increased his rhythm. She begged, and he gave no quarter, adding another finger, increasing the intensity until she went over the edge, her palm against her mouth, the only thing preventing her scream from tearing into the night. When her body had stopped shaking like a leaf, her brain started to function again. So that was what all the fuss was about. Jared leaned forward and smoothed her hair back from her place. "What did you say?" "Nothing." Oh my God, had she just said that out loud? He gave her a curious look, then a slow smile curved his lips as he rose to his feet, worked his palms beneath her, and swung her up into his arms. That was one. Bailey's heart pounded with every step he took toward the gorgeous turquoise blue bedroom. She had to tell him, now. "Jared," she poked a finger into his shoulder, "stop for a second. I need to tell you something." He halted mid-stride, his gaze flickering to her face. "What?" Color rushed to her cheeks, rendering them a red-hot mess. You should know that I am, The words died in her throat as he went as gray as she was red. "You are goddamn joking." And that, my friends, is the end of chapter 6. Are you interested in finding out what happens in Chapter 7? Then come back and we'll find out together. Bye for now.